Dear guests, we have 30 valuable minutes. My name is Natalia Gumeniuk. I'm Ukrainian journalist, co-founder of the Reckoning Project on documenting war crimes. And together with my American colleague, Thomas Friedman, who's known globally for being foreign affairs columnist for the New York Times and being the writer, we have an opportunity to talk to Acting Deputy Secretary of State of the US Department of State, Victoria Nuland, on the theme which is named Path to Victory, a view from the US government. Interesting enough, it's not said it's Ukraine's victory, it's victory. Welcome being here. And before passing the mic to Thomas, I should say that we can really say that the American help and support isn't taken for granted here. And in Ukraine as such, and Thomas would speak more about that, while there is one thing which is definitely we should take for granted. In this particular audience, a lot of people, almost everybody, followed your visit, the visit of the State Department team to Ukraine, read carefully what was said. So we want to go a bit in depth, but Thomas, you have the first say on your also, reflection on what you also heard here after that.
Great, well, thank you so much. Hi, Tora. It's been a remarkable conference. For me, it's my first time in Ukraine since the war started. And of all the compelling presentations we've had here, for me, the most compelling was yesterday. It was a group of soldiers who came from the front, literally, to share their perspectives. And what I heard in their conversation was an interesting tension. And it was along two axes. One was, we are as committed as ever to recovering every inch of Ukrainian territory and sovereignty. We're also more tired than ever. We could not be more grateful for the help of the NATO allies and the United States, and we couldn't be more resentful that you won't give us the weapons we need to finish the job. And I found that tension, running through that conversation and many others. And I just wanted to share that with you and see if that's something you could react to.
Well, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Natalia. Hello, everybody at Yes. I wish I could have stayed to be with you in person, as Natalia said, having been in not just Kyiv, but in Yalta and up north over the last 2 days. We, the Secretary and I and our whole team, once again, powerfully impressed by Ukrainians' courage, resilience, but also, as you said, Tom, that there is quite a bit left to do. It is very clear that as we head, deeper and deeper into this conflict, that it is exhausting, that it is a grind on the soldiers, obviously, but also on Ukrainian society. And for all of us supporting Ukraine, we also have to continue to make the case why our people, our taxpayers, our Congresses, our parliaments need to stay with Ukraine for as long as it takes. So as you said, Tom, this is hard work on all sides. And it's one of the reasons that the Secretary came not just to Kyiv, but went north to some of the towns that were the first invaded by Russia and are still working to recover, to look at demining efforts, at psychological trauma of those who were stuck in basements, etc. On the battlefield front, as you heard Secretary Blinken say, this counteroffensive obviously has been very, very difficult. It is kilometer by kilometer, but we are also impressed by the steady progress being made, particularly in the south. And, the defenses that the Russians had more than a year to put in place are something that we haven't seen in 100 years. So it is not surprising that it is difficult for Ukraine to figure out how to get through it, but it's also difficult for us to know precisely what is needed until Ukraine confronts these kinds of barriers, et cetera. So what we've been trying to do week on week, month on month, is stay in the closest possible contact and rush the kind of mine clearing, tank tooth clearing, things that are needed, longer range fires, and we got a good sense of what is needed for this next stage of the fight when we were there, and we will go back and work on all of those things going forward. But I do think that one of the things that came home to us on this visit is no matter how much success is had in the next days and weeks, this is a long fight, and it's also going to be a long fight to rebuild Ukraine, and that all of us need to prepare ourselves psychologically and materially for that.
Deputy Secretary, you mentioned again this phrase which we appreciate, we will be with you as long as it takes. But could you elaborate that? And to what extent it could be rephrased in the idea that we can win this war as soon as possible? By that, I don't mean, a fast counteroffense, but generally the narrative in which we have a feasible end and put our resources to make it, as soon as possible and frame it that way. What would you say on that?
Well, thank you, Natalia. I think we are looking at this on three axes, if you will. The first is obviously the battlefield. So making that progress so that Russia first cannot advance itself, but also can see the human cost to its own forces, its own economy, and helping Ukraine get to that point and have what it needs to be able to put some of Russia's most precious assets at risk. And that is one way to make them think harder about whether continuing on the battlefield or being willing to talk is in their better interest. So that's one axis. But even as we support Ukraine in trying to survive on the battlefield, we also already, as President Zelensky has been doing and Prime Minister Shmyhal, need to accelerate the process of thriving in those parts of Ukraine that are not occupied. So from this perspective, the $500 million that the US committed as quick start funding for the Ukrainian economy's reconstruction, we are looking at all kinds of projects like trying to speed your ability of getting your products to Europe, whether it is grain, whether it is steel, whether it is agricultural products, whether it is electricity and energy, to interlink Ukraine back to the European market where she should be, create jobs at home so those who come from areas that are now relatively safe are willing to come home and broaden the tax base. We will soon appoint a very senior American to be our point person for working with the Ukrainian government and working with the EU and other allies and partners on reconstruction so that people can start to see that the economy is coming back. You already have some predictions of 1% to 2% growth in 24, which is just remarkable given that the war continues, but we want to see that grow. And then the third piece is obviously the human piece, where there has to be accountability, there has to be a sense for the people of Ukraine that they are not alone, and for Russians that this is a fool's errand, that they are sacrificing, that their president, Putin, is sacrificing their future, their wealth, not for their country, not for their livelihoods, but for his own imperial fool's errand. So it's an election year in Russia next year as well. In Ukraine, as we said at the beginning, Tom, this is going to be a long endeavor, not just on the battlefield, but in the rebuilding. And all of us need to be mentally and psychologically prepared. But most importantly, we need Putin to know that we are going to be there for the long term. I forgot one piece, which is even as we work now on continuing to support the fight day on day, week on week, we are also working intensively with Ukraine and with our other allies and partners on Ukraine's force of the future. so that as soon as we can, Ukraine has the strongest, most deterrent, most modern military, and that's supported not just by the United States, but by 28 other countries who have offered long-term security support to build that military. So the next time Putin tries to push forward, it's simply impossible. So we're working on all of those fronts, and it is not easy. You know that better than I do, but even as this fight goes on, we need to see this daily life begin to flourish again across Ukraine wherever it's possible, and the economy begin to grow, and in parts of Ukraine where crops can be planted, where steel can be milled, where tech workers can be recruited and start to get back to supplying the best technology to the world, that begins to happen as well.
You know, Tori, one of the best parts of coming here, I've always said as a journalist, if you don't go, you don't know, is hearing the questions people have and also the opinions. And, one of the questions I've been asked and have had to answer when people ask about American aid is to remind people how remarkable the level of American aid is, given the fact Ukraine is a country that 99% of Americans not named Mike McFaul could find on a map. And so the fact that we are giving this amount of commitment has been, I think, quite remarkable. On the flip side of that, though, I've been asking, we just had a remarkable panel on this. I would say there's a broad consensus here that Putin's been playing with our head on nuclear weapons. Medvedev, threatening that if we go too far, if America gives Ukraine the wrong long-range weaponry, he could pull out a nuke, and that's kind of intimidated the Biden administration. And there was a really interesting and healthy discussion on that. I wondered if you could comment on both those.
Tom, I'm going to be cautious in an open forum like this. Sure. You will notice that it's been a long time since Putin's been making nuclear threats. More than 6 months, 7 months, 8 months. First of all, because not only the rest of the world and Ukraine, but his own country doesn't like it. And they don't like it because Ukraine sits right next to Russia. And it is very hard to imagine how you could use such a deadly weapon without it having equal, if not worse, impact in his own country on every level. Physically, obviously, but also in terms of the mass increased opprobrium that would result, and the complete isolation of Russia, which is pretty heavily isolated right now. And then if you know a little bit about nuclear weapons, and here I want to be cautious, there are very tiny ones, which would only have the impact of increasing Ukrainian resolve and drawing all of that global opprobrium. And then there are larger ones, and the larger ones, as I said, are not so easy to use in the country right next to your own. So that is not the issue in the conversation that we are having. I think the issue remains ensuring that we have and can get to Ukraine what it needs at every phase of the battle. And this changes over time, as we've made clear. Now, as you go through tank trench lines, the amount of mine clearing equipment, et cetera, that's required is completely different than at the beginning of the battle. That we are also helping Ukraine and ourselves revving up military industrial production to ensure that we have what will be needed over the longer term, not just for this fight, but as I said, to rebuild a Ukrainian military of the future that's maximally deterrent. And that goes particularly to a new kind of air defense system that will be required for Ukraine. And part of that is the F-16s, which will be coming, which will take some time to get up in the skies with the training, but it also goes to what we've done with getting Patriots in and NASAMS and Hawks and all of those kinds of things, and staying ahead of Russia in that regard. So what's most important is that we have a clear understanding of how this battle is evolving, and that we are able to maintain the support at home and with our allies and partners and get the right stuff in. But you are right, Tom. The amount of money that Americans and other allies have spent supporting Ukraine is enormous in terms of what we spend around the rest of the world. So part of the reason for the Secretary to come, for the President to continue to talk about Ukraine, particularly as we enter our own political cycle, is to remind everybody at home and in Europe and in countries like Africa and Latin America and the Middle East and Southeast Asia, who want more from the United States too, that if Ukraine does not win, does not succeed, if Putin does not fail, this kind of evil is going to be normalized all around the world. And that's why we're making the investment in Ukraine, in addition to the fact that Ukraine stands on the side of right, stands on the side of the UN Charter, stands on the right side of sovereignty, territorial integrity, democracy, etc.
Deputy Secretary, in this room, especially we Ukrainians, we are constantly asked by our international partners and friends, what is our view of Ukraine's victory? What is that? And we speak about genuine security guarantee, and wherever we start to explain when we are asked and try to imagine that one of the security guarantee, if we speak about impossibility of the assault, secondary assault after some time, is not inventing the wheel. It's something like NATO. You know, that you can invent a lot of different things, but that's how it looks like. So to what extent the US are ready to take a lead on that, if we speak about the Ukrainian membership in NATO?
We've talked about this a lot. First, when we talk about Ukraine's long-term security, obviously the thing that would secure Ukraine the fastest would be if Putin just got out, right? He shows no evidence that he's going to do that anytime soon. So again, as we've been talking about, we have to work primarily on the security side, but also on the economic side to show him that this massive hemorrhaging of Russia's own future is not paying for him. But we also have to ensure that Ukraine has the kind of force that isn't simply about holding territory if he won't get out, but is also about deterring any kind of future push forward. And even if he were to get out, you're going to need a maximally deterrent military, because we know that as long as he's in power, he'll keep trying again. So that's what we talk about when we talk about this force of the future. That we are starting to conceptualize, fund, and build together with Ukraine and with our allies and partners. With regard to NATO, we are continuing to evolve the Ukrainian relationship with NATO. But what I need to say to this room is that it is Ukraine's future in NATO is also tied to its democratic future, and the Secretary spoke to this a little bit. NATO countries have a set of shared values, a shared way of governing and living that they have to maintain. It's not simply about a country's military strength. So Ukraine's ultimate path to NATO, yes, is going to go through the security vein, but it also is going to be a function of continuing to reform as a democratic state, continuing to fight against endemic corruption, which unfortunately is still a Soviet legacy problem in Ukraine, and continuing to modernize the economy, the judicial system, a free press, all of these kinds of things. So again, yes, the war must be won, but it's not just the war on the battlefield, it's the war for the future of Ukraine that is free, maximally democratic, that is clean, that has independent checks and balances within its democracy. So those are other things that we're working on. with Ukraine on the road, not just to NATO, but to the EU as well.
Tori, you sit at the interface between the administration policymaking and the U.S. Congress appropriations. I know that I think there's like a $20 billion supplemental up, and someone in the administration said, that may be the last supplemental we can get through before the election. And I wondered if you could just share with people, whether that's correct or not, the politics of this now in America, continuing to amass the resources to push this story over the top where we want it, at a time when we're heading into an election, at a time when Putin isn't shy about indicating that his strategy is to wait for Donald Trump.
Thank you, Tom. Well, this was one of the things that we discussed and that I'm sure President Zelensky will feel if he comes to New York for the UN General Assembly, that we ourselves are heading into a political season. And as much as we can be proud of the strong bipartisan support for Ukraine, really remarkable support when you think about how many issues divide us in the United States over so many years, every single dollar spent on anything in the US budget now in this highly political season is subject to intensive debate. So, for example, our national budget for everything domestic is probably going to run on a continuing resolution for the rest of President Biden's first term, meaning that all budgeting is flat, not a single dollar, not a single penny for anything new. So we have to make it work, and that's a result of the politics. So when we go in and say, for just the period of October 1st to December 31st, we need $20 billion more for Ukraine, we have to make the case why this is about America's future as well as Ukraine's future. And then we will almost immediately be back into a new budget cycle talking in October and November and December about the budget that we need for all American operations for the electoral year, for the period from January 1st at least to September 30th. So we will start this conversation all over again. So again, that is why, as you said, Tom, this is obviously the heart of this battle is in Ukraine, but all of us have to make sure to connect what you are fighting for to our own future and the kind of planet that we want our own children and grandchildren to live on. And the fact that what happens in Ukraine will have implications for every other part of the world. And we need to do that not just with the US Congress, but we need to do it with friends and partners around the world, from Africa to Asia to the Middle East to Latin America.
You mentioned that the support to Ukraine is really huge, also compared and plays a huge role in the American foreign policy compared to a lot of partners globally. It's extremely significant. And here in this room and in Ukraine, you feel, Ukraine dominates US policy. However, when I had a chance to be shortly in Washington, D.C. and talking to the people there, I heard more and more talks about, threats from China, as if there is a competition, who is a bigger villain, China or Russia. And that's how it's framed, that, there are more threats from China coming, there are more thoughts on that. However, won't the victory of Ukraine make the impossibility of the conflict with China less likely to a huge extent? And whether this thinking is at all, present, to what extent it's there? That Ukraine's victory is not something instead, but the path to the victory.
So, Natalia, this is exactly the argument that President Biden, Secretary Blinken, Secretary Austin are making in our Congress. And again, we're gratified that we do still have strong bipartisan support for both a strong Ukraine policy and a strong China policy. And people do, particularly those who've been in the security business for a long time in the Congress, they do understand the linkage, that if we don't stop the rampaging of Putin in Ukraine, then other autocrats and regressive powers will feel freer and have more impunity to bite off a piece of a neighbor themselves, and will challenge us to see what we're going to do about it. So there is a linkage there. But there's also a need on the US side, given that Russia's war in Ukraine is our most acute and immediate challenge to the free and democratic order, to simultaneously ensure that we can support a free and open Pacific with longer-term investments, everything that we are doing to strengthen our ties with our allies and partners in their own security, Japan, Korea, Philippines. You'll see the president heading to Vietnam later this week to ensure that there's freedom of navigation in the Pacific, that there's no economic coercion, and to the extent that there is of democratic powers, that we can support them and nip it in the bud and create resilience, that countries are not, including Ukraine, are not economically dependent on a China that could close its doors or change the rules of the road at any time, that we have other places where we can make chips and semiconductors and all of these kinds of things. So we've got, as the United States, to, as we say, walk and chew gum at the same time. And I think we have, with strong bipartisan support in the Congress, made the case that, but we need to continue to do so to the American people, that what we need to do in Ukraine is one set of things, these immediate security support, and then getting you on a path to strengthening your own military over the long term. But what we have to do in Asia is different but equally important, namely build up resilience, security resilience, economic resilience, strengthen the rules of the road so that we maximally deter. And in fact, there are lessons that come from supporting Ukraine that we can apply in the Indo-Pacific and around the world to deter some of the kinds of coercion, economic, military, et cetera, that we might see coming from China. So we've got to, as the United States, work on both. It is not zero-sum. And it's not even zero-sum in terms of physical weapons. So for example, Ukraine at the beginning of the fight needed a lot of javelins. You still need some of those, but those are the weapon that deters when the enemy is first starting to come across. They are less useful for having to fight back against entrenched defenses. In a Taiwan context, you see a lot of javelins moving to Taiwan because it's a defensive weapon. So these are the kinds of cases that we have to make on the Hill. And if you would like to come help us with the Congress to explain how these things are linked, we would welcome you.
Tori, we're winding up here, but question I had, you pick up the news from Russia these days, and there's just some, bizarre stuff. And I believe it was 2 days ago we read that Putin was going to meet with the leader of North Korea to seek, military assistance, which is, it's like picking up the paper and reading that Citibank went to its local pawnbroker for a loan. That's like not a good sign at all if you're Russia. Could you give us your assessment of sort of economically what is biting, what is hurting? What does that tell you that he had to go to North Korea for help?
We've said this before. It's just pathetic that this supposedly Russian mighty military has to go begging in North Korea. But it speaks to many other things. It speaks to the courage and strength of Ukrainian defenses and how much of its mighty military, particularly its ground forces, Russia has had to hemorrhage on this little imperial dream or aggressive imperial dream of Putin. It also speaks to their inability, because of sanctions that we have mounted globally, to produce in Russia at the level that they need to sustain this Putin fantasy. And the fact that they are being starved of high-tech components, et cetera, for their military. And it speaks to the fact that very, very, very few countries, only the most autocratic, the most closed, are willing to help Russia militarily, whereas Ukraine has a security coalition of more than 50 of the strongest democracies around the world. So, you know, as we said, this Russian aggression against Ukraine is first and foremost a tragedy in Ukraine, and I have to say, having been with the secretary in Yadina yesterday, 2 days ago, it just reminds again at a very local and human level the incredible suffering of the Ukrainian people individually, and the incredible brutality and inhumanity of the Russian aggressors. But it's also a tragedy for Russia that this is how Putin has chosen to spend the wealth of their nation, and that he is throwing them back at least a generation in terms of their own future, and that, you know, many of their own young have gone to their deaths over this. So we need to continue with strength and with unity to make the case to the Russian people too that this war is not paying, that it's driving them greatly further into poverty, into isolation, and that it's time to get out of Ukraine.
Deputy
Thank you
Secretary,
for the opportunity to be with all of you.
Okay, do you have the few minutes for the final question?
Sure.
Okay, so that would be the final, and you finished with Russia, and I should say that we often ask this question that, you know, to what extent the US are afraid of Russia losing. And here Michael McFaul, who's just in front of you, also mentioned that in some cases the US foreign policy towards Russia failed. And it's very hard to control what's happening in Russia. It's beyond our control, while what is happening here is in our control. So in this context, I would ask you to reflect on that, because these things are in a lot of minds of the people. But also, I want you to finish with the very brief explanation. So what is the victory? What is the view from the US government, if to make it short? Thank you so much.
Well, obviously, the greatest lesson to Putin, the greatest lesson to those in Russia who have supported and maintained Putinism, would be for Ukraine not only to survive, but to thrive as an open, reformed, clean democracy, in juxtaposition to the Russia that has emerged after 20 years of Putinism. And one could argue that that might have been part of what was in Putin's mind when he launched this full-scale aggression this time anyway, that Ukraine's success was too much of a threat to his own model. I personally feel that unless and until there is a change of orientation in Russia itself, and it starts focusing on its own economy, its own future, its own modernization, things are just going to get worse there. But that takes you to what victory looks like. Obviously, it would look best if we could convince him to get out, and then the job would be about rebuilding Ukraine. Ukrainian defenders are doing their very, very best with our support to take back every kilometer of Ukraine, and at least to get themselves in a position where they can hold his installations in Ukraine, and including in Crimea, at risk, and that's extremely important for causing Russians to address their own strategy, but also for getting Ukrainian land back. I think what victory looks like is a Ukraine that thrives. However long it takes to get every kilometer of Ukraine back, you also need to be simultaneously, with our support, building back the economy, the society, the life and culture of the parts of Ukraine that you control. You need to be becoming increasingly European, get your economy growing again, which it's on track to do, and have people come home even as this fight continues, and continue building up your military for the longer term, because we've now seen that we can't be sure that even if this war ended tomorrow, that it couldn't happen again. And so we have to be working with you on all of those fronts, and we are.
Thank you. Thank you. That was the Acting Deputy Secretary of the United States, Victoria Nuland. So give a round of applause.